Testing. Yep. I think I can stand. Just make sure that's working. All right, we ready? Action.
You go this way.
Welcome, everyone. Very excited to have so many faces here in person for this really special night for philosophy and psychedelics. We're going to explore the big questions with an incredible panel. We've got Dr. Trail Dowie, Dr. Chris Letherby, and Dr. Sam Douglas. And my name's Dr. Lani Roy from the Signs of Life. And before we get into tonight's panel, we'll just take a moment to drop into this space together. And if you feel like it, you can close your eyes or you can leave them open. But tonight we're going to explore knowledge, and in order to do this, we need to really honour the traditional custodians of the land in which we're on, this incredible country of Australia, and how lucky we are to come here together to explore the profound mystery that we're all a part of life, and this curiosity of mind, and to be able to explore these big questions in this incredible country. And we are here tonight to look at psychedelics and plant medicines. And as we do that, just a big gracias to all the incredible lineages, wisdom holders and altars around the world that have been working with these medicines for thousands of years in symbiosis and with a lot of reciprocity. And yeah, as these medicines make their way to our labs and our clinics, and they've been such a vibrant part of the community in Australia long before the psychedelic boom, may we really, try to integrate the science and the sacred. That's a big part of why we're here tonight. So in order for tonight to be a huge success, I just want to invite everyone to be mindful of the space, as we want to open the doors of perception. We want to explore the big questions, ethical concerns, the challenges of this space. And if we can do that by just looking after each other and being sensitive to rigorous debate and what the presenters have today. Also, please feel free to raise any ethical concerns or discussions about the field in Australia or overseas. But if we can just not name any organisations in particular, and any guides, any people working in the underground, we just want to really protect this space and make sure that that we can have these discussions in this way. So Julian will introduce these incredible panel members tonight in more detail, but I just wanted to acknowledge why I've brought them here personally. And we'll start with Chris. I've only met you at the EGA conference, and it was just an incredible moment where his mind really sparked my curiosity, and I just instantly wanted to know more. I wanted to know more about how he thought and his rationality to the theory of mind and to philosophy. Being a psychedelic practitioner, this field can be pretty ungrounded at times, and we really need to call on these methodologies and ways of thinking and knowing so that we can, hopefully not only experience altered states of consciousness, but learn how to integrate them into embodied ways of being, into our values, into our behaviour. And this is where I feel philosophy and people like Chris can help in that journey in rational thought. And Trail, I just want to acknowledge Trail. I've got a huge love and respect for this man. His dedication to psychotherapy and his students is profound, and I'm very, very lucky to have been mentored by him. And every time I walk away from supervision, I feel very overwhelmed at all the things that I have to learn. And I've got several degrees myself. I've been studying for decades. But he continues to ignite topics that I've never even heard of or thought about, and a real privilege. Thank you. and Sam. I'll be really looking forward to get to know you tonight in a different space than the president of the Australian Psychedelics Society, and the incredible work that you do for the community in the harm reduction space. And really, shout out to the Australian Psychedelic Society tonight, and Baden and Adam as well for your support, and really just championing that, the rights to a sovereign mind and freedom of consciousness, and the right for people to, engage in substance use, not just psychedelics, but for harm reduction, and for our country to rise to the challenge of public policy that really matches the reality that we all exist in, and that we have our bodies and our minds, and how do we navigate that with sovereignty and education. And Julian, we've just met. I know nothing about you, but I'm really glad that you're here tonight to work on this panel, and looking forward to getting to know you. So just briefly, my name's Lani Roy, and I'm the founder of the Signs of Life Psychology, which I began about 13 years ago, initially working predominantly in the space of sexual trauma and family violence and sign language. So I'm fluent in sign language. This is a picture of me saying basically love and thank you at the same time. And over the course of the years, we've expanded to include a range of services, from psychedelic trial consultation, student placements, preparation and integration, supporting people through spiritual emergence or psychosis, or trying to navigate which one is it, which one came first. Very passionate about harm reduction, and excited to be an associate researcher at Swinburne with incredible team looking at a trial for psilocybin and body dysmorphia, as well as exploring the ayahuasca Diatero experience from a qualitative, community-based perspective. I will read out our pillars at the Signs of Life, because it is something that is really holding me in this work as we open a new terrain of mental health, this massive decision by the TGA to allow psilocybin and MDMA into our mainstream mental health setting, which I'm incredibly excited about, but it comes with a lot of risk, a lot of caution, a lot of ethical challenges when we open these powerful medicines into human systems that are inherently flawed and at times corrupt and dangerous. And I really want to draw on these pillars of courage, to explore the frontiers of medicine and self, integrity, to embody safety, truth, and a strong moral compass, and integration, to have a real balance between the sacred realms of these medicines as well as science and what is the evidence saying, and community, because community is everything. We can have a peak experience, but how we integrate that and make that into meaningful medicine with our home, with our partners, our workplace, our children, is really what matters. Just a shout out to some of the incredible pioneers in the space tonight. Entheogenesis Australis, who have been working, consistently and tirelessly behind the scenes for I think about 20 years now, and do an incredible job with ethnomedicine and plant knowledge and conferences. And the Australian Psychedelics Society, their harm reduction and events. There's some information down the back if anyone wants to chat to Baden or Adam later in the break. And Silo, Prism, Psychedelic Research in Science. We've got EPIC, which Sam is a part of as well, which is an international organisation specifically dealing with ethics in the psychedelic space. And Psyche, which is pioneering DMT analogues and ayahuasca. And AMAP, which I'll speak about briefly in a moment. And a huge shout out to all the universities that we work with at the Signs of Life, Vic Uni, Deakin, Monash, that I've worked with for nearly a decade now, and the Somatic Psychedelic Institute for Psychedelic Therapies with Saj Ravi, who's really pioneering the cannabis-assisted psychedelic space, and ketamine. And huge shout out to Dr. Jamie at Ananda Clinics for his friendship and his incredible wisdom with cannabis and CBD and the endocannabinoid system. So in the last couple of months, we've founded a charity called AMAP, which is the Australian Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Practitioners. And this came out of a very grassroots, organic response to the TGA decision, realising that we don't have a peak body for psychedelic practitioners, we don't have codes of conduct, a membership association, we don't have a peak body that can represent the therapists as well as the training pathways, accreditation, etc. So I'm a board member of that, a founding member, and we're really excited to see what this community can grow together, being unified, that there's a multidisciplinary voice. So it's not just psychiatrists and clinical psychologists, even though they're incredible, but we want to see paramedics, mental health nurses, counsellors, psychotherapists, social workers. This is a huge opportunity with these medicines for us to unite in a multidisciplinary way and really shift the paradigm of mental health from a biomedical model into, of reducing symptoms into people thriving and using multiple modalities to reach their full potential. Yeah, so before I pass over to Julian, just want to highlight the enormous potential of psychedelics. Psychedelics shift the conceptual context of well-being, moving from symptom management to amplification or release. We know that it can move us from disconnection to relationality, from rumination to responsivity, from self-definition to self-agency. And as Dan Siegel eloquently puts, psychedelics can teach us to really live at the threshold of the unknown with the courage to move into new and uncharted waters. So I invite the panel to explore these waters tonight and have the courage to ask the big questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Lani. Alrighty. So can everyone hear me? Okay, yeah. At the back? Great. Okay, well, as we kick off, we'll have time for questions towards the end. So maybe we'll have a good period of time for questions. So just save up any thoughts you have as we go along, anything that strikes you as interesting that you'd like to share. Jot it down if you can, or just keep it in your head, and we'll get there. But yeah, just to kick off, so this panel discussion is going to orient around the philosophy of psychedelics, but particular attention is going to be placed around philosophy of mind and cognition, with a focus on epistemology and ontology, value theory, the nature of the self and self-awareness, and questions concerning the clinical application and uptake of psychedelics. So to start with, I guess I wanted to say that it's a really rare pleasure to be emceeing a panel exclusively composed of philosophers. And Signs of Life should be applauded. Lani should be applauded for getting this together. So thank you again. So we're also incredibly fortunate to have this particular panel. I'm only going to introduce them briefly because we want the conversation to speak for itself. But to start with, to have Dr. Trail Dowie bringing a great deal of clinical knowledge and experience, a rich background in transpersonal psychology, a practice as a philosopher of science, and also a great knowledge of continental thinking and continental philosophy. To have Sam Douglas, a respected philosopher of language in his own right, but willing to speak from his experience within the psychedelic community, and as a volunteer working as president of the Australian Psychedelic Society, and as founder of Psychedelics Overground. And of course, we're also grateful to have Chris Letherby, Dr. Chris Letherby, who's recently published monograph Philosophy of Psychedelics, has created significant ripples and is shaping a lot of the discussion around the academic and clinical uptake of psychedelics internationally. So it's going to be a really interesting conversation. Perhaps we could thank our panelists for coming. Alrighty, so let's just jump right into it. I will generally address questions towards one person or to the panel as a whole, but anyone else can feel free to jump in response to any question that I pose. Yeah. And Chris, you've got your mic. Yeah, good. So first one's for you, Chris.
Yes.
It's not the case that everything psychedelics tell you is true. It's not the case that everything psychedelics tell you is false. Why, Chris, do you think this is an important caveat for the current psychedelic moment? Just as a note, I'm quoting Chris on that.
Yep, I confess I did say these things. Am I on? Am I coming through, by the way? Yeah, cool, thanks. Yeah, so I think it's important just because very few people... Oh, and actually, just before I launch into it, I just want to give a brief acknowledgement of my own. I want to thank the Monash Centre for Consciousness and Contemplative Studies, M3CS as they're known, who invited me here to Melbourne and sponsored my visit. So it's partly thanks to them that I'm able to be here. So big shout out to Jacob Hovey, Professor Jacob Hovey, and M3CS. So yeah, why do I think this is important? Because while very few people would actually explicitly claim that everything psychedelics tell you is true or that everything they tell you is false, still I think assumptions along these lines often seem to be at work. So, if you look throughout the history of how psychedelics have been received in Western society, in modern society, there often is a tendency to go too far to one or the other of those extremes, you know, in people who favour what I call an entheogenic conception of psychedelics, a conception of them as kind of spiritual or you know, divine revealing agents. There can be a tendency to accept uncritically all of their deliverances. And then on the other hand, in sort of more mainstream secular society and among people who are inclined to the philosophical worldview of physicalism or materialism, you know, the idea that everything in the universe is physical or material, there can be a tendency to assume uncritically that therefore psychedelics don't have anything to teach us, that we can't gain any genuine insight or knowledge from these experiences. And I think both of these assumptions are equally implausible. It's really clear that some of the things psychedelics show you are not true. Just basic examples, you know, the wall looks like it's melting. You can objectively show the wall is not melting. It's staying still, right? So we know that there's some misrepresentation that goes on. But then on the other hand, some of the sorts of epiphanies that people have, especially when we focus on more down-to-earth things like psychological insights, autobiographical insights, emotional breakthroughs, it seems very implausible to me to think that people aren't gaining genuine knowledge in some of these sorts of experiences. And the implication, because the rest of the quote that Julian didn't say is that psychedelics are not going to tell you which of the things they tell you are true and which of the things are not, right? You can't ask psychedelics for the answer to that question because whatever they're telling you, they're going to tell you it's true. That's kind of how it works. So if you want to know which of the things they tell you are true and which are not, I think the conclusion is unavoidable. You have to think about it. There has to be some use of reason, of rationality, of weighing of evidence and other considerations after the experience itself has subsided. And so the question then becomes, which of the kind of apparent insights do we accept, which do we reject? And there's a lot of room for debate in there. I have my own sort of set of answers to these questions, which some of you would find more plausible than others. But that's kind of the basic point that I think everyone needs to appreciate is unless you want to go to either of those untenable extremes of sort of uncritical acceptance or uncritical rejection, there's no alternative but to philosophize about it, actually.
Thanks, Chris. Maybe as a lead on for Sam. So I know you hold a bit of a pragmatist position in relation to this, the truth or falsity of insights derived during psychedelic experiences. Could you speak to why that's important to you?
Sure. I think it's I mean, part of this, I think, is, as I say, it's pragmatic. And in my mind and from my perspective, it's because there are some things, as Chris points out, some experiences that you have under psychedelics, when you're having a psychedelic experience, you can very easily check if they're true or false. You can touch the wall, you can sort of, whatever it is that you're experiencing, you can verify whether it's really happening or not, after the fact, if not, in the moment. But then there are other things that happen that are in the category where you have to think about them and work out whether they're true or not. And it's very much, I'm in agreement that these psychological insights often kind of fall into that category where you can sort of go away and think about it. It's like, is that really how I feel? Is that really what my life is about? Or whatever insight it is that you've gotten, whatever the message seems to be coming through is. But then there's these other experiences that people can have where they're really, in my mind, they're not things that can be kind of empirically verified or not. They're not things that you can kind of do an observation, we can do some science and figure out whether it's true or not. Or you can't, you can't reason. In my opinion, at least, it's hard to reason, rationally determine whether or not this particular things are real or happened or not. And we have a whole kind of category of things already like that. This isn't new. This is kind of the category broadly that a lot of people quite rationally will place, a lot of religious beliefs in, where people have very strong beliefs in things. We can neither confirm nor deny that this kind of greater metaphysical reality of particular religions. So rather than kind of constantly have it out and spill loads of blood over whose version of reality is right, you can just make a decision to say, look, this is something that's just we're never going to agree on. There's no way to scientifically or rationally kind of verify this, so let's just kind of put it to one side whether or not it's true and concentrate on what kind of the outcomes are of these beliefs. So I think if a belief is leading to people harming themselves or each other, then you really have to sort of think about that. That's worth addressing. And I don't think that's a hugely controversial thing to say, that's worth addressing if a belief is causing people to harm themselves or each other, that we should do something about that or think about how we address this. But if it's not, and we can't really kind of prove it either way, then we just, it's worth pursuing in a philosophical sense, but it's also the case that, with limited time and resources and, in the interests of not kind of constantly throwing down every time we have a different vision of reality, that we just kind of go, we'll just put that to one side.
Great. Thank you, Sam. And so good pitch for the pragmatist stance. Trail, I feel that you should weigh in here as well. So you've got all three positions. Truth or falsity? What's the take?
Both and. No, I mean, I guess I come down on Sam's end of the equation when we're talking about real-world implications and applications, but I think I'm much more aligned with Chris in terms of the implications of thinking about psychedelics. In particular, one of the things that I think is really central for philosophers to consider is psychedelic experience provide a whole series of things that need to be thought about, and they may have implications for how we understand and think more generally philosophically. I think there's a large body of work that exists in parallel to this, which is Eastern philosophy, where there's a great deal of similarity in terms of some of the states that are being spoken about. And those are worth kind of considering and talking about. I guess definitionally, when we're trying to ascertain whether something is true or not, one has to ask what are the conditions of truth, and whether we kind of get to a kind of Starsky's kind of, if the snow is white, then it's, sure. But I guess I would be interested to kind of get a deeper sense of what we really mean when we say that something is true, when we're talking about psychedelic experiences. It clearly can't be just a subjective truth that we're speaking about, but perhaps there is something to be said about the support of these experiences over large bodies of time, over many different cultural settings. Perhaps there is something that really needs to be thought more seriously about it than merely reflecting on it. And this is the point that I'm most interested in that Chris raised, is a merely reductive materialism. I think that's one of the things that this work brings into sharp question very readily. So.
Great. And we're going to be going into each of these topics in a lot more depth. So while we're talking broad terms around truth or falsity, we're going to go into the nitty-gritty. But before we do so, Trey, I have another question I'd like to pitch at you. So trained yourself at MAPS Institute, having trained the first batch of psychedelic-assisted therapists and psychiatrists in Australia. I want to pose sort of the obvious question. How does psychedelic use help us redefine how we think about clinical work?
Yeah, well, I think that's a very big question, but and I'll be interested to hear what Sam and Chris have to say about this. I know this is something that Chris is also interested in. One of the features for me is that I think it raises fundamental questions about the whole foundation of psychiatric systems of knowledge. The whole perception of discrete and unique disorders, I think, get really called into question here, and actually what we might be seeing is that there's a way of thinking in a more meta view about what's going on in mental illness and psychological states. Those who study with me here in the room will know what I'm about to say, but there isn't a single psychological disorder that's not correlated with metacognition being impaired. And if I was to think about what is it that altered states generally, in particular psychedelics or meditative states, provide, it is an amplified or increased metacognitive view. The challenge with psychedelics is how to stabilise that view. But if we look at that in terms of psychiatric implications, what we can really, I think, start to say is that there are features of organisation and disorganisation of mind which correlate and are connected to metacognitive capacities. These medicines seem to have a pretty clear experiential frame in which they work, in that they disrupt one's ordinary view and provide people with what we would normally call an advanced metacognitive perspective. So seeing wider, deeper, more fully into the world, experiencing the self and the world without contradiction, these kind of classical advanced metacognitive states. That to me raises real questions about what we're doing in mental health and psychiatry in general and clinical practice. One only needs to look at how that system is not working and the problems that are being caused, with the current treatment model. So, yeah, I think that there's a whole bunch of questions, but I'd be interested to hear what you guys have to say about that.
Yeah, so I like the metacognition angle. I mean, the angle I've tended to take about psychedelic therapy is that all the conditions for which psychedelics show therapeutic promise seem to have something to do with self-representation, so the brain's mental representation of the self. So we know, particularly in depression, there are characteristically these rigid, negative core beliefs, as they're called, so core beliefs about the self. I am unworthy, there's no hope in my life, whatever it might be. But these things have been found, changes to self-representation and to associated cognitive capacities like attention and salience, the perception of what's meaningful and important. These are all intimately bound up with the mental representation of the self, and they're all known to be altered across various mood disorders, addictive disorders and substance use, all the kinds of things for which psychedelics show promise. And there's an obvious connection between metacognition and self-representation, because what you're doing in metacognition is precisely representing your own mind. You're mentally representing your own mental states, your own thoughts and emotions and so on. So, yeah, I am am very on board with the metacognition idea. I would view it as sort of just a slightly different perspective on the angle that I take on the transdiagnostic potential of psychedelic therapy. And I think another really useful construct is psychological flexibility, right? So this construct that we get from third wave behavioral therapies like acceptance and commitment therapy, dialectical behavioral therapy, and it's I should say, you know, I'm not trained in any kind of clinical psychology or psychiatry, so this is just my layman's understanding of this stuff. But psychological flexibility, as I understand it, is basically the opposite of experiential avoidance, right? So the more different types of experience you're kind of willing and able to undergo without shying away from them or resisting them or whatever, the more psychologically flexible you are. And apparently there's a lot of evidence that psychological flexibility and experiential avoidance are transdiagnostic predictors of psychiatric distress. So across all these different conditions, it's very closely related to ideas from mindfulness. I mean, ACT and these sorts of therapies were originally derived from Eastern meditative traditions, mindfulness and so on. And so we've got other constructs like decentering, which is used in the science of mindfulness, which is the ability to sort of detach a bit from one's mental contents and view thoughts and feelings as just thoughts and feelings, not kind of a reflection of me and not a kind of infallible reflection of reality. And this ties very directly into the ways in which metacognition and self-representation come together. So in the theoretical perspective that I've developed on psychedelic therapy, what's going on when you get this kind of increased psychological flexibility and decentering under psychedelics is precisely a disruption to self-representation. So the brain's model of what is me and what is not me, and where the line is drawn around me, is becoming blurry, it's becoming unstable, and so then you have things like all these thoughts and feelings suddenly starting to fall maybe outside the boundary around me, and then you can view them in this way that involves taking them less personally and seeing them as just thoughts and feelings, and then of course you've got, you know, enhanced metacognition right there. So I'm going to try not to go on for too long, but just briefly, I'm really interested in this other point as well about the implications for psychiatric nosology, so the taxonomy of mental disorder, and what does the, if anything, does the transdiagnostic potential of psychedelic therapy tell us about that? And of course, there is this broader move afoot, you know, independently of psychedelics, away from a kind of view of discrete disease entities or disorder entities and towards what's called a dimensional approach to psychopathology. So the idea that we can characterize all these different conditions in terms of impairments or alterations to various core dimensions of psychological functioning. And I'm sure there's a lot of complications that arise when you really try and make this argument, but to me, intuitively, it just seems obvious that, yeah, psychedelics seem to tap these core cognitive processes, self-representation, attention, salience, emotion, whatever, and then they seem to have these, you know, the very, very similar benefits across all of these, what we consider to be different conditions, and to me, that seems like pretty good evidence in favour of the dimensional approach.
That's great. You're preempting all the questions.
Sorry.
Throw these away. No. Well, that was that's a good lead-in. Maybe I'll just throw that one back to Trail around the psychedelics as panacea, right? They're broadly, non-specifically effective for a wide range of ailments. So, what does that suggest to you?
Yeah, well, as Chris was saying, there's a kind of nosological kind of implication for it. But I guess for me, the psychedelic panacea is kind of the issue, because, and I'm interested to hear what gentlemen have to say about this, but one of the features of it, I guess, that I've spent a lot of time thinking about is that states don't correlate with stages. And so it doesn't matter how many altered states you experience, it's not by necessity going to cause a stabilisation of that state into a stage change. And so the real clinical question, I think, is not the evocation of the experience. I think it's pretty clear that's pretty reliable. I mean, something like 80% of people on psilocybin in trials will experience some form of mystical experience. But what do we do with that at a clinical level? How do we then stabilise that so that we then move this very rich experience, which is transient, into something which is a stabilised feature of mind. And here, metacognitive approaches to therapy can offer a lot in the integration phase, where we're really working to try and stabilise the perspective over a long period of time. I think it would be true to say that the longer a state is, or the view or the metacognitive capacity of a state is held for, the more likely it is to stabilise into a stage. And I think that there's a real frontier there in terms of clinical work that is really not well developed. The integration models that exist in a lot of the psychedelic assisted therapy, to be generous, are pretty poor, I think. Not very well clinically thought through, and there's a whole bunch of kind of issues with them on a whole bunch of other levels. But I think that there is a real opportunity to take these ideas that we're talking about at a philosophical level and connect them in with the leading edge of clinical work, which, you know, has a lot to do with metacognitive practice. So,
look, I mean, I was just thinking, and this is, you know, I mean, if anything, I'm less qualified to speak about, you know, the specifics of psychiatry than either of these two. But I think that this is certainly this is something that I've thought a lot about and has discussed a lot with other members of the community when we're sort of people have reflected on their own experiences, and it is definitely this case of trying to maintain what, you know, a sort of a thought or a feeling or an insight is something that does require, you know, I'm not sure if effort's the right word, it's ongoing. And thinking about the ways that these are going to sort of, you know, what's going to work in this is where a lot of the, I think a lot of the effort needs to go to. As an example that I think about, and I will tell the story now, and luckily there's not a heap of people I know here. So, you know, most people, if I launch into one of my anecdotes, won't have heard it before. Thinking about metacognitive processes and mindfulness and things like the idea of beginner's mind, the idea of seeing things really anew, which is a really, as if for the first time, that's a really useful idea. Therapeutically, it's a really useful idea for people, a useful kind of perspective that people can take on things. I had an experience once, the first time I took LSD, I had this particular experience. The rest of it, you know, was you know, interesting, but the most noteworthy thing that I remember is sitting around outside, and this is, you know, all of my stories, I should, you know, predicate them by saying, don't do this, or, you know, maybe take a more mindful, considered approach to these things than I did when I was 20. But, you know, out in the real world where psychedelic use happens, where it's just like you go to a party and someone's like, hey, do you want to buy some acid? I'm like, great idea. But sitting outside with these people that I'm getting to know, and the LSD is coming on, and it kind of crept up on me. And I had this really, really bizarre experience that will just stay with me forever, where I'm looking across this table out in this veranda outside in the night air at a man that I've just met. And just at some point, I'm looking at his arm. I'm thinking, there's something wrong. There's something wrong here. What's going on? There's a thing on his arm. And I couldn't work it out. I couldn't work out what it was, what's going on here. So I'm staring for what I have been told later was a really long time, and I got up, walked around the table, and I leaned right in, and I'm looking at this guy's arm, because I just cannot fathom what is happening here. And I just turn to him and say, what is this? And he says, mate, that's my watch. I had just totally lost the concept of what this thing is. And, you know, I mean, once I'd recovered from my embarrassment, because, as you can imagine, it's dead quiet. Everything, all conversation has stopped to look at me. But it's a thing, you know, it's really funny. It's a funny story, but it's a thing that I reflect on. It's a thing when I go back to my own mindfulness practice that I reflect on, because what a really amazing experience to have. How often do you ever experience something that's completely new? How often do you ever see something as if for the first time? It's a really, really profound thing. How do you replicate this? How do you capture that? How do you kind of take this and sort of take it forward in your life. Those are really difficult things. Being, that age and being at a time where none of us had heard of integration. What is that? There was lost opportunity in some ways, but but maybe not in others. But I think about those sort of experiences and how you work with those, how you capture them, but also at the same time how trying to induce that sort of experience in someone and then work with it, how potentially kind of paradigm smashing that is for the way we currently think about mental health.
I mean, the level of skill I think that's required to work in that register is probably the great challenge actually for mental health professions. It is not possible to sit at a distance and be away from the experience. You have to somehow be ensconced or involved in the experience. And that, I think, for many people in a mental health field is quite scary, because we're trained often to keep away from the interiority of someone who's crazy, mad, unwell, or whatever kind of euphemism we want to use to describe it. So there's something, I think, very profound about the level of skill in the clinician, the level of organisational capacity within the clinician to hold and work. I mean, one of the interesting things is, in Chris's book, you call it psychedelic therapy, but I would always call it psychedelic assisted therapy, because I always think that the therapy is primary, not the psychedelic. So there's lots in that, and I know there's some people in the room who have done the training in this, and I think the level of skill that's going to be required to do this in a meaningful way, and it not go down the pathway of a 1960s kind of crash and burn. I think we have to be very careful about how that's addressed at a clinical level, because the dangers, I think, are very real.
I'll just make a couple of quick points there. One is just that psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy is a mouthful. So often in papers nowadays, I just say at the start, look, psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy, psychedelic therapy for short. It's snappier, it rolls off the tongue. But also, this is something we could get controversial about. I'm not convinced the therapy is primary, for what it's worth. I'm not convinced that it really is just psychotherapy assisted by psychedelics. I think in some cases, maybe the experience itself is primary, and what is really important is not necessarily formal psychotherapy, but integration of some kind, whether that takes the form of a manualized therapy or my view, for what it's worth, is that the connections between psychedelic states and meditative states, mindfulness and related practices, are really deep. There's this idea that goes back to the 1950s and 1960s, and there's been a long-running debate about, are there really deep and profound and important commonalities between psychedelic experiences and the states engendered by Hindu and Buddhist meditative practices, or is it just that, Alan Watts and Aldous Huxley and co were already really into Hindu and Buddhist meditation, and so they interpreted the psychedelic experience through that lens. My view, for what it's worth, is that it's the former, that there are actually really deep commonalities, and that there is something especially well suited about these kinds of meditation practices, and then also therapeutic modalities that are based on psychological flexibility and decentering and these kinds of things that are, particularly well suited for psychedelic integration, for kind of transforming those transient experiences into kind of stages or traits or whatever.
So if I can pick that up, if it is, I noticed you used the word, it's the experience which is primary, which I would agree with, and I would think that the therapy is very much about constructing the conditions for the experience. But what I was saying is that it's not necessarily the medicine itself which is primary. And I think there's good evidence for that if we look at recreational use. So if 30% of the population, I think, is that the estimate in Australia? 30% have tried psychedelics at some point?
I don't think it's quite that much. I think it's around. Actually, I think it's about 10% in their lifetime.
Is it? Is that low?
It's about 10% in their lifetime, but it is, sidebar. It is rapidly growing. It's gone from, in the past 12 months, I think it's gone from, a few years ago it was 1% of the population in the past 12 months, and it's gone from that to 1.6% in the last 12 months, and most of that change has happened quite rapidly.
Right.
So it's.
So I think we'd have a pretty good test case there if that those people that 10% of the population that have engaged in recreational use, if it was just the medicine itself and not the total picture of therapy, then one would expect that they would have good mental health and those things wouldn't be a problem. And I don't think there's much reason to think that. But so I like this idea, though, you talk about the experience. Like, what are the conditions for creating this experience?
Right, yeah, good. So a couple of points. First of all, there are actually a heap of big sort of survey studies and whatever that purport to show correlations between lifetime and past year psychedelic use and better mental health outcomes of various kinds. I don't quite know what to think because I don't have the sort of know-how to critically assess the methodology of those studies, and I know they have been criticised a fair bit, but there supposedly is at least some evidence for a correlation between psychedelic use and better mental health. But so I totally agree. It's not the substance itself, it's not the chemical, it's a particular type of experience, and to get that type of experience you need a particular setting, and you need a particular rapport with a guide or a therapist or a sitter or whomever. I wonder if we could call it therapy-assisted psychedelics. I wonder if we could turn it on its head, because I do think this could be tested conceivably in a bunch of interesting ways, but I am very tempted to think that it is a particular kind of experience that is important, and what all the rest is about is, first of all, creating the conditions for that kind of experience to happen. Indigenous traditions know a lot about how to do that. Modern Western, clinical protocols have developed pretty good knowledge about how to do that. As you said, in some of these studies, I think it's in some of the studies of healthy subjects, it's kind of 2/3 of people or thereabouts having a complete mystical type experience according to the psychometric criteria. But so creating the conditions first for this kind of experience to happen, and then for it to be converted into some kind of stable psychological trait or some lasting change.
Yeah, and I really agree with you, Chris, there, that the integration from a clinical perspective is the most important piece. I think that's where the clinical skills are most relevant. Obviously, some of the other conditions I think can occur in other registers. But there's also something there that is very interesting, which is there is such a delineation between people who are unwell and then people who wish to explore their own mind, people who wish to optimise their own mind, and how we make sense of those kind of questions as well.
Well, maybe let's put a pin in that one, because we've opened up quite a few interesting themes. But let's continue with this this subject that we've touched into, this distinction between, what comes to mind for me is the gradualist versus like a sudden realization path. That would be the analogy in the contemplative traditions, right? So I'm curious to hear your takes on that. If we're beginning with this idea that psychedelics have a commonality with the sort of experiences induced through psychedelics, share some commonalities with the experiences induced through contemplative practices. In Eastern contemplative traditions, there was a focus often upon a gradualist pathway of sort of preliminary practices in order to prepare the individual to integrate those experiences. So do you feel that psychotherapy can occupy that space in a Western or secular context? Just to open that to the panel.
All right, I guess I'll answer that one then.
Everyone's looking at you.
Okay, everyone's like, no one wants to answer that one. Well, look, that's difficult. I think my gut answer is right now, no. Not where we are, right now in the mainstream. I think it's the extent to which, these kind of frameworks that and I know the kind of things that you're talking about, where it's this kind of gradual approach to, walking before you run, in terms of intensity of kind of non-ordinary experience. Look, I think it's possible that, and likely that psychotherapy will kind of occupy this in time, but it's also, there's a lot of other...
Maybe I should clarify something as well. So with the gradualist pathways, the focus on preliminary practices generally is around preparation of character and personality structure prior to entering into altered states. So it's more of an interesting question about perhaps how psychedelics would be utilized in therapeutic sessions as well. Would it be after a certain period or otherwise? But continue, yeah.
Look, I mean, I think construed that way, yes, but there's also, look, it depends on what is the limit of the work that you can do depending on the context before you have the experience. What is required, who is a person required to be in order to be ready to do this, optimally ready to do this.
Who decides?
And who decides?
You get to decide.
I get to decide, right. I'll just make something up. When you're talking, it's just, I think about these sort of practices, and particularly if you're talking about developing these internal qualities, you're trying to, you're trying to cultivate particular, traits, particular virtues almost, before you get to the point of having the peak experience. Yes, you could do this via therapy, but it's pretty different to kind of how we normally approach these things these days.
There's something very interesting in all that. There's something very problematic about it as well. I'm very fond of philosopher Charles Taylor, and he's written a lot about the way in which we've lost access to the transcendent with this kind of reductive materialism, with our fixation on capital, fixation on individual identities. We've lost access to these transcendent roles or capacities. And so I don't think it's any mistake that in the West, people crave these transcendent style experiences, and they look for them in lots of places. And people get on an aeroplane and fly over to the Amazon or whatever it is that they're doing. I think they're really articulating a cultural problem, which is who holds the means to access the transcendent. And when you ask those questions, I think in indigenous and traditional cultures, there are people who are gatekeepers. There are gatekeepers for these experiences and these medicines, and not done in a kind of hierarchical or arbitrary way, but rather there is a responsibility with the wisdom involved in these substances that require people to use them thoughtfully and in a considered way. That doesn't really fit very well here in our society. We made that joke, well, who gets to decide? We are so radically individualist, we are so radically kind of self-interested that we're not going to accept someone telling us we're not ready. And I think it's very interesting that psychotherapy or psychiatry or whatever it is becomes the natural kind of resting place for these medicines in our society, because where else could they go? We can't really, there is no, religious order that one can believe in or take hold, where one could, undergo training and experience. There's no singular cultural motif or mythology which we share. So where else could it be?
Great, perfect segue into what I wanted to say. So I want to answer the original question by describing my favourite study in all of psychedelic science. So for people who know the literature, Smigielski et al. 2020, great collaboration between Swiss researchers and Zen Roshi. And so Zen is an interesting tradition that, different lineages have varying emphases on kind of sudden versus gradual realization, but they all have elements of both, a period of practice leading up to some kind of Kensho or Satori or whatever. So what happened in this study was, with the support of this obviously very open-minded Roshi, a group of experienced practitioners, I think they all had at least 5 years of, traditional rigorous Zen training, went on a standard 5-day group retreat, sesshin, and they kind of went about their normal meditation retreat routine. So in a group doing about 4 hours of seated meditation a day, plus various other things. On day 4 of the 5 days, in double-blind fashion, they had psilocybin or placebo, and then continued their normal meditation retreat routine. And as you you would expect, the psilocybin group had these really deep experiences of ego dissolution, self-transcendence, and so on. Very interestingly, they had lower levels of anxiety than are typical at those doses, suggesting that their lengthy Zen training did equip them to kind of handle and navigate these states. And then there were all these really interesting findings after the retreat, you know, as you'd expect. Both groups, everyone had increases in mindfulness, well-being, all this sort of stuff from pre to post-retreat, but the increases were bigger in the psilocybin group. They then got the meditators to sit in the fMRI, neuroimaging scanner, and practice various types of meditation. And in open awareness practice, which is the one that is supposed to kind of lead to these insights into no self and so on, the psilocybin group showed a greater ability to deactivate the default mode network, which is the system that's associated with self-representation and the sense of self. So, I mean, there's a lot of kind of very rich little leads there, I think, that point to, and I mean, you know, there's been a lot of work that's been done over the last several decades in kind of figuring out how Buddhist meditation practices in particular could be secularized, and there's a lot to kind of debate there about babies and bathwaters and so on, but there are, you know, there seem to be a lot of successful models, successful cases of kind of self-transcendent contemplative practices being made available in a non-medical, non-psychiatric way to the kind of spiritually seeking public in the Western world. So that might be a place, that might be a home outside of psychiatry that psychedelics could find.
And Trail, just before jumping onto that, I'd love to hear, as the clinician specialist in the room, we know that psilocybin and MDMA are being rolled out in Australia. Could you fill us in on some of the pragmatic details? How's that going to look? What do we know at this point?
We don't know. We don't know. It's coming, is what we know. That's the full detail. I mean, there's still lots of jockeying and lots of... there's lots of issues. There's lots of issues. As I said, I think Lani named this before. This could very easily go pear-shaped. Yeah. It really, really could. But hopefully we have enough wise, considered people in the space who can see the benefits of it, and I'm obviously an advocate for the benefits of it. I mean, I've sometimes been criticised for not being
too enthusiastic
enough about psychedelics per se, and I'm like, well, my interest is really focused largely on their clinical benefits for people who are suffering, in particular. You know, out of my areas of kind of clinical interest, you know, I've worked a lot with soldiers, and you know, the value of having, you know, something like an MDMA therapy available, or even a psilocybin therapy available for those guys could just make huge differences to people. And I hear all the time, you know, we were going around and around with this, that, oh, it's too dangerous, it's too, you know, these are the safest medicines in our society, essentially, when they're done in controlled conditions, and these people are killing themselves every day. So
Trail, on that then, so there's the... What are the conditions for it to go pear-shaped? What are the lack of controlled conditions that you're concerned about as a clinician?
I see two pathways of it going pear-shaped, personally. One is someone goes cowboy on it and does something really stupid. Hopefully that's not where we go, and things like AMAP and other groups are trying to make sure that there's procedures in place to stop that. The other way is it just gets strangled. It becomes purely the province of biological reductive psychiatry. People get given a medicine in a lab somewhere, in a room or in a clinical room, and they're left by themselves or something, you know. And we have plenty of examples of where these problems have already existed. I mean, the biggest example is SSRIs, where these medications were developed to be used in conjunction with psychotherapy, and now people are placed on them for life with no psychotherapy. And that's not what they were designed for. They're not the conditions it was researched under. That's not what it was about. And
Trail,
that's a danger.
Yeah, and so just speaking to the public there, what is it that is particularly concerning about being placed alone in the world? This might seem obvious to a lot of people in the audience as well, but for those who aren't, like, why is a therapist an important adjunct, at least in the psychedelic
and this
process?
is the point that Chris was making before. It's not necessarily a therapist, but it's it's been well known, since the 60s, this idea of set and setting, as it was articulated, it has a huge impact on people's experience. And so the context in which, we do not engage in the world at the level of synapses and neurons. We engage in the world at the level of experience. And so the context and the experience that's set up for people has a huge impact on the quality of experiences which flow out of that. And that's why it's important.
Thank you. Some reflections from either or.
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to pick up on the ways that things can go pear-shaped. I mean, I think I largely agree that these are the risks. But this is something that we've done before, and something we've actually done before quite recently, particularly in New South Wales with ketamine. Yeah. Anyone who, it's not even that long ago. I mean, it's coming up on 10 years for the kind of whole episode with ketamine and Aura Medical in New South Wales. I mean, as many of you know, ketamine potentially has a lot of promise with alleviating symptoms, particularly around depression and suicidality and a whole kind of range of things. And there's work is ongoing on this. And in 2014 or prior to this, it still is technically possible to prescribe ketamine off-label. It's not approved for use in depression, but it is technically, you can do this. And we had a situation, particularly in New South Wales, where what started off as, a careful, considered, good practice became this just kind of sausage factory of get people in, give them a shot at ketamine, kick them out the door, or even better, send them home with their ketamine, to inject it themselves, So for whatever reasons, as you can imagine, as the number of people going through these practices picked up, eventually things started to go wrong. There was bad publicity, there was accusations of malpractice, the regulators got involved, and the whole thing, ground to a halt. What was being done wasn't great, but also I knew people, because so many people went through this, a lot of us knew people who are getting this medication that was really helpful at the time. So this was all cut off, and the publicity was so bad that not only did it become virtually impossible to have ketamine for depression, all the funding for the research that was happening dried up because no one wanted to be associated with the bad press for this. So this is like when people say that this can go really badly wrong, and this is for ketamine, which isn't as controversial, as, albeit, which makes no sense because it's actually, potentially more harmful than MDMA or psilocybin. But yeah, we already have recent examples of just how badly wrong this can go, and it's set back not just the practice but the research in ketamine in Australia, set it back by a decade easily, and so the stakes are quite high.
Yes, thank you, Sam. And so that opens on two sort of threads that I was hoping that we'd address as a panel. So the first one there is precisely on this question of the integration of the medical industrial complex with the broader economy, and as a result, sort of the way in which these substances will potentially be uptaken to profit, driven by profit interests primarily. Is there any comment from anyone about this?
Above my pay grade. I'm just a philosopher of mind. I don't know what to say about that.
Well, I can say something about it. Well, I think the first thing to say is that there is no way of escaping capitalisation. We live in a capitalist society. There is no escaping that quality. The question is, does that become something which is cynical and exploitative, or is it something that can be both mutually profitable for corporations and for individuals who are seeking help and support? My concern is that if that's unchecked, and this is this is something that's pretty simple to kind of get one's head around. If these things are unchecked, if the market is unchecked, then it will move towards exploitation as a matter of course. But if we have checks and balances in place, and Australia is an ideal country for that to occur in, right? It's not like the United States. We have a smaller population, we have more government influence, we have a stronger, national regulator. Things are set up for that to go quite well. But, of course, that's something we need to be careful of. But we also need to not get too caught up, I think, in any form of money making as being a problem, because the reality is it's the money making which supports the research. It's the money making which provides all the other kind of avenues for it to develop in our society. That's just the way that it goes, and we just need to be sensible about that, I think, and just be wary of frontier industries being overly vulnerable to some form of robber baron coming in and trying to take control of it. I think there are significant attempts to create patents on things like psilocybin and things like that, which are obviously problematic. But hopefully, in Australia, we've got an avenue where those things will be relatively protected.
Thank you, Cheryl. Yep.
Just a quick tip, the work of Shayla Love is really good on this, by the way, a journalist who's been writing about psychedelics for Vice for a long time. She has a great series of articles on patents and the kind of issues surrounding patents in the psychedelic space, which I found very illuminating.
What was her name again?
Shayla Love, Love. Yep, Shayla Love, lots of articles in Vice.
Vice, yeah.
Great. Thank you. And otherwise, it's a watch this space for Australia. How does it get taken up? So the other thread in relation to ketamine, I know a number of people who were prescribed ketamine for conditions, and it was interesting to hear stories of psychiatrists prescribing substances with no real interest in the mechanism by which they worked experientially. They just looked at the facts. The statistics showed that they alleviated symptoms, so they prescribed it. So that brings me into a subject I'd like to open onto, essentially the connection between experiential and propositional knowledge. So how does psychedelic experience inform our methods of truth-seeking? So I'm asking about the epistemology of the role of experience.
All right, this is a Chris question, but just for the audience, epistemology? You might want to...
So for everyone, epistemology is our theory of knowledge, or our methods of inquiry. And ontology is the theory of what exists. And within philosophy, there's a dispute about the status of experience, or the value of subjective first-hand experience in bringing about, as a guide to knowledge, which is obviously a point in interest when we discuss psychedelic insight and how that might serve as a mechanism of therapeutic change.
Yeah, sure. So it is a really interesting question. How might psychedelic experience itself affect our epistemology? What I've focused on in my work is more the converse question. How can the existing resources in epistemology, the philosophical study of knowledge, help us to understand psychedelic experience and to sort out the epistemically valuable, the experiences that really are valuable with respect to knowledge acquisition from those that are not? There's a famous thought experiment, which probably some people have heard of, which has interesting parallels with psychedelic experience. And this is the Australian philosopher Frank Jackson's thought experiment about Mary, the super neuroscientist. So I don't know, how many people have heard of Mary in the audience? A few, okay, yep, maybe around 15%, I would say. So for the rest of you, I'm going to tell you one of the most famous philosophical stories of the last 50 to 100 years. So Mary, at some point in the future, when neuroscience is complete, we know everything there is to know about the human body and brain and nervous system. For some reason, Mary lives her entire life in a black and white room, right? There's no colour in the room, and she becomes an expert in the neuroscience of colour vision. So she knows absolutely everything there is to know about what goes on physically in a human brain and body when someone sees something red, when they have the experience of visually perceiving something red. But of course, Mary herself has never seen something red. She's never had that experience. One day, she leaves her black and white room for the first time and she sees something red. So she has that experience for the first time. And the question that has generated a whole heap of philosophical discussion is, does Mary learn something in having that experience? Is there some new fact that she was previously unaware of that she learns by actually seeing something red for the first time? And the original point of the story was supposed to be, yes, there is, right? There's obviously something she didn't know from all her neuroscientific studies. What is it? Well, she didn't know what it's like to see red. She didn't know what it's like to actually have that experience. And so the point of the story is supposed to be that no amount of purely physical knowledge or purely scientific knowledge about the brain and body and nervous system can tell you what it's like to have an experience, and therefore the implication is supposed to be that the physicalist worldview is false, right? There's actually more to the mind, there's more to consciousness and to experience than just neurons firing. Now, actually, most philosophers don't believe that, right? They don't believe the thought experiment does show that, but then it becomes this very interesting puzzle, you know? So if this doesn't actually show that a physicalist or materialist worldview is incorrect, how do we understand what happens to Mary? You know, does she really learn something in that experience? If so, what kind of thing does she learn? And how can it be made compatible with a materialist or physicalist worldview? Well, I think you can ask parallel questions about psychedelic experience, and it really does highlight this question of experiential knowledge, right? So you can imagine someone who's an expert on the neuroscience of psychedelics. Maybe in the future we know everything about what goes on in the brain when you take LSD or psilocybin, everything about the synaptic events and the changes to brain network connectivity, and then that person has a psychedelic experience for the first time. And this is a way of kind of sharpening the question to ask, well, do they learn something new? Are they going to learn something new in having that experience? And one thing I think that can happen, so obviously a very common, very popular and very traditional answer is that in psychedelic experiences we can gain metaphysical knowledge, right? When you have a mystical experience, a transcendental experience, you can learn that there is a spirit world, a divine realm, a ground of being, or something like this. I approach psychedelics from a materialist, physicalist perspective. We can talk about whether it's reductive materialism or not, but definitely materialism of some kind. And so the question I've been really interested in is assuming that we don't learn those kinds of things, right? Assuming that we don't really discover the existence of some transcendent metaphysical dimension out there, what other kinds of knowledge might we gain? What other kinds of genuine knowledge might be gleaned from these experiences? And I think something that falls broadly under the heading of experiential knowledge is one part of the answer to that. So there's a concept in epistemology which is the concept of knowledge by acquaintance, right? And this goes back to the British philosopher Bertrand Russell, early 20th century. And on an everyday level, it's pretty intuitive, right? So you can know about someone indirectly. You can hear about them, you can read about them, you can know all these facts about them. And then rather than knowing about the person, you can meet them and come to know them directly. You can become directly acquainted with them. And we would then say that you've gone from having mere knowledge by description of the person to knowledge by acquaintance with them. And I think this is one of the big things that psychedelics can do, is actually they can give you, in a way that is otherwise very hard to get, knowledge by acquaintance with certain facts about your own mind, right? So facts like your mind has all this potential. It has the potential for these states of kind of acceptance, serenity, wonder, awe, kind of feelings of harmony and connectedness to the universe. Now, you can know that your mind has that potential indirectly, right? You can go on Erowid. I don't know how many people know Erowid. You can spend all night reading trip reports. You can read Aldous Huxley, The Doors of Perception. You can read the mystical literature of the world's religions, and you can have this justified intellectual belief that, oh, wow, my mind has all these incredible incredible capacities, but it's indirect, it's an inference. Whereas if you then take kind of 25 milligrams of psilocybin or 200 mics of LSD or something, then in the space of a short couple of hours, you can come to know in the most direct way possible that your mind has all this incredible potential for this vast range of conscious experience that normally goes unrealized in day-to-day life. And I think there are other things in this general ballpark too, right? So the fact, for instance, that the ordinary sense of self is not this kind of direct reflection of some kind of objective reality, but is actually a model of some kind created by the brain, an idea that is a point of convergence between Buddhism and modern neuroscience. You can come to believe that your sense of self, your sense of being an individual subject, is a mental construction by reading neuroscience, by reading Buddhist philosophy. But then in the psychedelic state, my thought is you can gain knowledge by acquaintance with that constructed nature of the sense of self as it becomes kind of deconstructed and altered and attenuated.
Wonderful answer. Thank you, Chris. And I really want to pick up a lot of those threads which will tie us back to your work on philosophy of psychedelics, your text, your monograph. However, before going back there, so you were mentioning Frank Jackson's thought experiment, something about Mary or whatever you termed it. Have you come across the Mary's on acid thing? Yeah.
Yes, I have. Yeah, Jussi Ilkka. Yep.
That's how you pronounce it. I was wondering.
Yeah. Great Finnish philosopher and psychologist who's doing work on psychedelics. I actually, by the way, years ago, I never followed through, but in the early days of my PhD, when I first had this idea about knowledge by acquaintance in the psychedelic state, I had to give a colloquium talk to my department on my latest PhD research, and I was going to call the talk Bertrand Russell on acid. I didn't do it in the end.
So that was such a great recount of the distinction between, or the case for experiential knowledge and how that served as a challenge to reductive forms of physicalism. The other part of that article from memory is a suggestion that the psychedelic experience parallels the contemplative Buddhist conceptions of the dissolution between the subject and object. So that author seems to suggest a perennialism of sorts. And I feel like this might be an interesting direction to kind of explore a little bit before we cycle back to philosophy of psychedelics, the book. So there's that question mark for the whole panel. The experience induced through various psychedelics and the experiences relayed through various contemplative traditions, do you believe that we have sufficient grounds to suggest that they refer to a common sort of invariant insight or knowledge by acquaintance?
I just want to make a quick point because there's an important distinction that often gets lost here, right? So the debate in the study of mysticism between perennialism and constructivism goes back to the 1970s, the work of Katz, and generally speaking, the question is there, as people like William James and Walter Stace thought, is there a single core mystical experience that you find across times, places, cultures, and traditions, and the experience itself is the same, but it's just the interpretation of it that differs by tradition and culture? Or is the experience itself always different? Is the experience itself, and not just its interpretation, affected by the cultural context in which it occurs? And so perennialism is the view that there is a core experience, there is a common core to mystical experience that you find across times, places, cultures, and traditions. But that in itself, that claim, the common core thesis it's sometimes called, is actually neutral about the metaphysics, right? So normally people who are perennialists also tend to believe that there is a real kind of divine reality or ground of being that these experiences are tapping into, but you can actually separate those claims, and so I sort of land in between. So I am a perennialist in that I think there is a common core to the experience, but it's not because I think there's a common reality being tapped into. I think it's just because across times, places, cultures, and traditions, functions, we all have pretty similar brains. And so there's a great label for that position, which comes from the Swiss psychedelic scientist Felix Hasler, which is neuroperennialism, right? So it's the idea that there is this kind of common core to mystical experience, but its explanation is neuroscientific rather than metaphysical.
Yeah, and Christine, I mean, I'm interested in your thoughts on this. I think, given how much time has been spent in recent decades on researching meditative practices, there is quite a bit out there now showing different states correlated with different neurophysiological activations or deactivations based on the type of practice. So whether it's a mindfulness-based practice or whether it's a concentrative practice will activate slightly different regions within the brain. So whilst there is something essentially common, there is also some space for variance, obviously. And I think that that's a really important point to name as well, because the vast variety of psychedelic substances provide different types of experiences, and those all have different types of value propositions associated with them.
Yeah, totally. So absolutely important to emphasize there is no such thing as the psychedelic experience. There is no such thing as the meditative experience. Yeah. My claim is there is a common type of experience that James and Stace and co were latching onto that can be induced both by meditation and by psychedelics. But in fact, meditation and psychedelics both kind of open up a region of experiential space, is one way you could put it. They kind of open the door to a whole range of different types of experiences. And I just think there's a significant overlap between the class of experiences that psychedelics give access to and the class that meditation gives access to.
And what about the constructivist dimensions, though? I mean, you know, it seems that there are strong constructivist kind of qualities in all of this. I mean, I always think that it's funny that a Jungian patient has Jungian dreams, a Freudian patient has Freudian dreams. You know, a Christian doesn't see Ganesh. And likewise with psychedelics, I think a lot of expectation effects are set up. And I think Evan Thompson's Why I'm Not a Buddhist, you know, really kind of points at this quite heavily around Buddhism. But what are your thoughts about that, guys?
Yeah, look, I think this is really, like, that kind of constructivist aspect of it is really, I think it's pretty solid. I think it's certainly really plausible. And I've reflecting on things, again, looking at things through the kind of prism of my own experience, even experiences that I've had that have been really profound and really, as Chris would say, have that deeply noetic quality about them. They feel really real. They feel really significant. But also in the back of my mind, sometimes it's been really obvious where this is. I now have a kind of knowledge, acquaintance style knowledge with something that I didn't have before. But I also know that this didn't just come out of nowhere. I read a book about it like 6 months ago, and now I've experienced an idea in a way that I hadn't experienced it before, but I know where that came from, or I can at least make a pretty good guess at that. Where I guess to back up considerably, where kind of Chris and I differ is that I'm far more agnostic about, if that's the right word, about kind of drawing conclusions on what these experiences mean in terms of the broader metaphysics. And it wouldn't be a huge surprise to know that I fall probably into the significant but definitely minority of philosophers who are kind of still unsure about what the Mary thought experiment actually means and whether or not it is a challenge to physicalism, which is a much less disreputable position than it was even 10 years ago. Metaphysics isn't dead, apparently. But it is, there is, and so, one of the things, but it's good to actually to be able to connect back to the constructivist ideas are important because I think just, pragmatically, and that they will be important therapeutically because you can sort of, instead of me thinking, wow, I've just had this experience of what it's like to be outside of time. I've had this experience of time as a distance, where, you know, it didn't come out of nowhere. It's like it's a thing that I knew about. I studied physics. I've read books about this stuff, and I knew I'd read a book about it relatively recently, so I could kind of go, yeah, I had this experience and it seemed really real, and I can maintain my kind of agnosticism about this, you know, whether, you know, but I know where this idea came from, so this allows me to kind of take a bit of distance from the immediacy.
Thank you, Sam. So on exactly that, could I redirect back to Trail on this one?
Could I just quickly on that, on the unreality of time, interesting anecdote. The physicist Carlo Rovelli, who's been involved in developing, you know, theories of loop quantum gravity in which, you know, time is not a fundamental feature of the universe, he's gone on record as saying LSD experience has helped him formulate these ideas. And I think this is one of the interesting epistemic points, that one of the things psychedelics can do for you epistemically in relation to your knowledge is actually negative, right? They can make you realize how many of what you've taken to be bedrock features of reality are actually just models your mind is creating. And I take it from the way Rovelli described this, this is the kind of effect that the LSD experience had on him, is it made him realize that, look, my subjective experience of time is actually a model that my brain is creating. And that doesn't show that time is unreal, but it opens up the possibility. It makes you realize that this might just be a story that your brain is telling because it's useful rather than because it fundamentally reflects the way things are.
I've often wondered about that with the resurgence of panpsychism. You know, how much of that resurgence is because people have actually had these kinds of experiences.
Trail, could you define your terms, panpsychism?
I want to hear what these guys have to say about it. I mean, panpsychism is there's a number of different variations of it, but it's a view that essentially, you know, consciousness is distributed throughout the universe, and it's like for a long time it was seen as pretty crazy. In fact, there was an article a while ago, wasn't there? Panpsychism's crazy, but it's probably real or probably right or something. You know that one?
Yeah, Philip Goff in Eon, I think that was. Yeah.
I mean, what do you guys think about that?
I will do my best to not be the typical analytic philosopher and start to quibble about definitions. But technically, it's that subjective experiences is everywhere. If, you know, depending on whose variety of panpsychism that you want to get into. I blame David Chalmers, by the way, you know, for this. But yeah, look, it's certainly, yeah, look, maybe it is. Maybe, I don't know. Maybe there was more LSD in philosophy departments than I was ever aware of. But it is an idea that is really ripe for being illustrated to, you know, by a psychedelic experience. But again, if you're already studying this, if you're already thinking about this, then you're primed to have the experience. But then, you know, so you've got to take that step back and think about what does that mean.
If it's all right, Sam, just before I pass on to Chris around your account of panpsychism and its relation to psychedelics, let's just define panpsychism a bit more for the audience. So if there's prevailing history of understanding a sort of physicalist bias which suggests that minds are essentially going to be bound in bodies and brains, a sort of identity reductionism claim which holds that minds are identical to the neurons upon which they supervene. So panpsychism was a challenge to that suggestion, to go further to say that there's something that mindedness or intelligence or consciousness could be extended in some way beyond the neurological bases which are familiar to us. So it's been quite an interesting innovation recently. So Chris, what's your take on it in relation to psychedelics too?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, the way I would put it is sort of physicalism says the ultimate constituents of reality are things that are non-minded and have no mind and no experience. And so physicalism says minds and experience get built up out of non-minded, non-experiential fundamental constituents. So whatever's at the bottom of reality, whether it's quarks or subatomic particles or whatever, physicalists say they don't have any experience or minds. You only get experience and minds when you put enough of those fundamental things together in the right complex ways. Whereas the panpsychist claim essentially is that whatever those things are at the fundamental level of reality, electrons or quarks or whatever it is, those things have already, right at the ground floor, some tiny glimmerings of mind or experience. And so then the kind of human consciousness we're familiar with is what you get when you combine these kind of already experiential fundamental constituents of reality in complex ways, as in brains. Yeah, so I mean, it is something that seems to come out of the psychedelic experience. Panpsychism, just broadly understood as the idea that mind is everywhere, experience is everywhere, experience is in everything, experience is somehow fundamental in reality. I don't think that's true, and I have a story about why this comes out of the psychedelic experience, which I think is quite interesting. So it's rooted in this view of what conscious experience is that is getting very prevalent in cognitive neuroscience these days. It's a view that used to be known in philosophy as indirect realism, and it's kind of out of fashion in philosophy nowadays. But the neuroscientist Anil Seth is famous for saying that conscious experience is a controlled hallucination. So, in other words, the experience you're having now of this room, these people, the sound of my voice, these tables and chairs and so on, this seems to you as though through your perception you're somehow directly in contact with the external world itself, these real things outside of you. But what Seth and others who are working in the predictive processing paradigm, this new kind of theory in neuroscience, say is that that's actually profoundly misleading. Your entire experience of the world is something like a virtual reality model happening entirely within your brain. So conscious experience is essentially an internal model or representation of the world that the brain creates in order to guide the organism successfully through the world. And so I hope that general picture is sort of clear enough. I haven't yet given you any reason to believe this, except saying, well, all these cool neuroscientists think it's true. I think there is a lot of good evidence for this view. I can go into that.
Just on a brief note there. So Anil Seth, I'm interested, because it feels like an interesting segue. Anil Seth, as a neuroscientist, he doesn't have a strong contemplative practice. Do you believe that contemplative experience itself could be directly related to insights along those lines?
Into this idea of conscious experience as being an inner model or a controlled hallucination.
Yes, precisely.
Yeah, I do. So I think my story basically is that there is a kind of insight that can be induced through psychedelics and through contemplative practice, which is often misinterpreted. It's a real insight that's often misinterpreted. And so the best way to understand it, for my money, is to think about lucid dreaming, right? So in lucid dreaming, you become aware that you are dreaming. You recognize that what you had previously been taking for the external world is actually, lo and behold, a model or a simulation being created entirely within and by your brain. So you're there, doing whatever you're doing in your dream, going around people, trees, tables, chairs, and then suddenly you realize, oh, I'm dreaming. And the insight that goes along with that is, this is all mind, This is all a mental construction. This is all happening inside my head. So I think something very similar can happen in waking life, in the psychedelic state and in meditative states. You can suddenly realize that, hey, this is all in my head. This is all mind. This is all a mental construction. But then what, for my money, is the misinterpretation is to think, well, this thing that I've just realized is all a mental construction is actually the external world, is actually the world outside of me. And if that's true, if you think that all of these actual other people and tables and chairs and so on outside of you are somehow imbued with mind or experience or consciousness, that's getting very close to a panpsychist type of view.
Right.
So for my money, it's a real insight. You've genuinely realized that all of this is a mental construction, but the correct conclusion to draw is this is all a mental construction inside my head.
Great. So wonderful. So before we move on again, I'd like to move into your book at some point, but Trail, I'd like to speak to you with a background in shamanism, and the study of those traditions, an interest in sort of process metaphysics. Could you speak to your reflections upon panpsychism in this vein?
Well, I guess it's not very popular, but I kind of agree, I guess, with kind of Chris's view. Having been involved, I guess, and studied directly kind of ethnomedicine for a long time, the feature of animism is prevalent. There's this animating quality to all things, from rocks through to, trees to animals. But just because that view is held, to me, doesn't seem to be it's something that we should espouse. I take a kind of more rationalist kind of perspective on those things. What's really interesting, I think, is when you go into those contexts with a rationalist view and have experiences which rupture your view of the rational. I mean, those have been kind of interesting experiences for me. I've told this story before, but I was once watching a shaman conduct a healing, kind of, fascinated to watch this group healing process happen. And he was summoning these snake spirits from the ground. And I was like, this is fantastic. Look at this. This is like this group hypnosis going on. This is so interesting. And people are shaking and falling on the ground and all these things are happening. And I'm like, so curious. Look at this. Like this person's they're just so influenced by this kind of cultural motif, and I'm finding it so interesting, and they're yelling and all these things happen. And then I look down and my leg's shaking. And I'm like, what's going on with my leg? This shouldn't be happening. I don't believe in any of this, but something. And so the qualities of influence and difference, I mean, I guess I'm quite happy to create a category of things that are just weird. And I'm just like, that I can't necessarily explain. And I think this is a really important point, actually, is I think one of the great dangers with any form of altered state practice is foreclosure of experience into narrative. And I think that one of the things that people will often do is they will try and make sense of an experience using some kind of language system or some belief system, which then forecloses the experience itself. And so one of the simplest things to do is just to maintain a kind of openness to experience. And, I think that's not to be derogatory, anything I've said here, to Indigenous practices or traditions, but it's just kind of my view is one that's more along the rationalist kind of view that Chris has espoused.
Thank you. And so we'll move towards questions reasonably soon. I just thought it would be interesting to give a head nod. Have you guys come across McGilchrist's work a little bit? Ian McGilchrist?
Sure.
Yeah. So so that we talk about, I mention him, bring him in because he seems relevant to the subject of animism and the question of whether or not we infuse the surrounding environment with life or not. So would anyone like to sort of, would you mind giving an account of his?
Well, I mean, McGilchrist is a psychiatrist, first and foremost, but I guess his latest work kind of crosses over into something much broader than that. The Matter with Things is a very interesting piece of work where he's essentially pointing out some of the problems of a materialist perspective. And being trained as a psychiatrist and a neuroscientist, it's always interesting when those kinds of thinkers generate those propositions. Is essentially, I think, articulating a kind of process view of the world, and that's one which is in good company in the people we're speaking about. I mean, we've spoken about James, Whitehead. Yeah. These people all espouse a similar kind of ontology, and I think Merleau-Ponty.
So I thought with the neuroscience, it's interesting the way that he speaks to the right hemisphere constructing a perception of the environment as one which has more life sort of infused in it, where there's more projection onto external agents as or external phenomena as agential. Do you have any reflections on how hemispheric lateralization might play into the metaphysics that we develop Either Chris?
Not really. I've never quite known what to think about McGilchrist. I mean, I don't know his work that well, and his whole picture of hemispheric lateralization, my understanding is it's pretty controversial in neuroscience, right? A lot of people think that lateralization can't bear the weight that he wants to put on it, and so I don't really have a strong view about that. Yeah.
Great. Well, so tying this on into naturalistic spirituality, Chris, I know just before we move into questions, I thought it would be good to, how does this all come back to the thesis of your work, Philosophy of Psychedelics, the textbook, Naturalistic Spirituality?
Yeah, so this is an idea I've been interested in for a long time. It's basically if one becomes convinced of the worldview that in philosophy gets called naturalism, the idea that the natural world is all there is, it's really, for our purposes, we can consider it as very close to materialism or physicalism, right? So there is no God, no afterlife, no spirit world. The mind is somehow something that the brain does, and so when the brain dies, that particular mind finishes. If you come to be persuaded of a worldview like that, does that mean that you have to reject spirituality, or is there room in a naturalistic worldview for something worth calling spirituality? And so the intuitive answer is, well, no, of course not, right? Spirituality is about metaphysical beliefs in spirits and in the spiritual, right? It has to be about believing that there is metaphysically something more. But I think the picture is more complicated, and I think there is this other way in which the word spiritual increasingly gets used, and it has to do with the so-called SBNR, spiritual but not religious phenomenon. There are all these people kind of saying, I don't kind of accept any traditional religious doctrines, I don't feel at home in any religious institution, but I identify as spiritual. And so spirituality in this sense seems to have these connotations of basically an approach to questions of meaning, purpose, and transcendence that is practical rather than theoretical, that is experiential rather than dogmatic, and that is all about finding practices that can engender experiences that take one sort of out of ordinary everyday waking consciousness and somehow imbue life with a sense of meaning or transcendence without. And so the kind of literature that I'm drawing on is in the last 20 years or so, a number of philosophers and other thinkers, neuroscientists and biologists have been arguing, look, there is room for something like a naturalistic spirituality. If we take the term spirituality in this term, then there are practices that can legitimately be called spiritual that you can engage in as a naturalist in intellectual good faith. You don't need to believe in a cosmic mind or a God or a spirit world to engage in the spiritual dimensions of existence. And so there's a really nice paper by a philosopher called Jerome Stone where he surveys all these different accounts from philosophers and scientists and others of what would that actually look like, you know, what would a naturalistic spirituality be about, what would it involve? And he extracts three pillars, right? He says what spirituality is all about is connection, so enhanced feelings of connectedness to self, to others, body, senses, the world, etc. Aspiration, so aspiring to realize our ideals and embody our values, and asking the big questions, so the questions traditionally addressed in philosophy, but that psychedelic experience also opens up, you know, why is there something rather than nothing, what happened before the Big Bang, these kinds of things. And then Stone makes this interesting point that all three, connection, aspiration, and asking the big questions, are all ways of breaking through the narrow walls of the ego. They're all sort of forms of what the philosopher Iris Murdoch called unselfing, of sort of inhabiting an experience and a perspective on the world that is no longer so tied to the kind of cares and concerns and goals and interests of the individual self. And I think the parallel between, and this is all like completely independent of psychedelics, right? But I think if you map this onto what comes out of psychedelic research, the parallels are striking. So when you read qualitative interviews with people in psychedelic clinical trials, some of them are meeting God, some of them are going to the spirit world, right? Some of them are not. Some of them are saying, look, I'm a materialist. I've always been a materialist. I'm still a materialist after this profound, powerful, transformative experience. I still don't believe there's anything more to reality. And yet the best word I have for it, the only word I have for it, is spiritual. This was a spiritual experience. And when you look at the themes that are common to people who visit the spirit world or meet God and people who don't, you find that it maps on exactly to what Jerome Stone is saying. You get connection, aspiration, asking the big questions, and on the theoretical account that I develop in my book, I think it is plausible that all of these are ways of breaking through the narrow walls of the ego. They all result directly from the disruptive effect that psychedelics have on the neurocognitive machinery of self-representation in the brain.
Wonderful. Thank you, Chris. Trell, do you...
Yeah, I just really liked that. I thought it was great. I found a great affinity when reading Chris's book, when I was reading through that, because I'd often thought about the need for a this-sided metaphysics, a kind of a way of creating a deeper sense of connection and engagement with the world, a transcendence that doesn't go away and elsewhere, but actually is present to the material world, and that there is more present here than what may necessarily be immediately available to some people's perceptions. So I really liked that and I thought it was great.
So for anyone who wants to follow up this naturalistic spirituality described by Chris, check out his book in Philosophy of Psychedelics.
Let's give it a better plug. Everyone go home and buy this tonight on Amazon. It's fantastic. In all seriousness, it is the best book that you can read at the moment on philosophy and psychedelics. So very lucky to have Chris here. Go home and buy it.
All right. Thank you for our panelists.
Thanks so much.
Yeah. I'll just put Lani on for you.
We've gone over time, and that was very difficult to stop because I loved it. So we're going to have just a 10-minute break and then come back for Q&A. So bathrooms are just straight down to the left and the right. And Baden is going to be at the APS stand with Adam as well. If anyone wants to chat to them about the Australian Psychedelic Society, feel free to ask questions there, and we'll see you in 10 minutes. Awesome. Yay.
Okay, everyone. So let's slowly, reasonably quickly meander back inside. Gather anyone who's drifted too far. We're gonna tidy this up. We've only got half an hour of questions, then we're gonna get booted out of here. So, yeah, thank you, everyone. Great. Okay, so how are we gonna do this? So yeah, everyone just gets settled. And then are they gonna?
There's roving. Oh, hang on.
Yeah?
Adam, do you mind doing the roving mic for people? Is that cool?
Great. They're directed to specific panelists. So they can respond.
We can share.
Yeah, we can share this one. Yeah. Sing out when you want to go. Alrighty, so we're going to have questions from the virtual sort of online audience and also from you guys. I'm trying to prioritize you guys because you came all the way. So raise a hand if you'd like to ask something of anyone specific in the panel, or more generally, just indicate when you ask your question. Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
My question's actually to all of you, and I'm specifically addressing what Trail said previously, just probably halfway through. I've got significant concerns in regards to, for want of a better word, the pharmacisation of psychedelic substances, in particular naturally occurring psychedelic substances like DMT and psilocybin. I have come from the pharmaceutical industry, and I know the reductionism, the monetisation, the harsh legislation that goes around these sorts of substances. And my question to you is, how significantly do you think that's going to impact your current culture? So, you know, we saw all this vibrant conversation around psychedelics and psychedelic-assisted therapies here. I mean, how significantly do you think, I don't know the word, the pharmacisation of these substances is going to affect you? I mean, you're coming from a philosophical standpoint. Are we going to then see psychedelic-assisted therapy, the entire realm of scientists, of, you know, psychologists who then, you know, you talked about just sending someone away to a plain room by themselves. But what about things like people who aren't qualified, who are going out and harvesting from nature, etc.? Do you think there's going to be a significant impact in the culture of the psychedelic-assisted therapies and psychedelic experiences?
Great.
Yeah, I think there will obviously be significant outcomes around that. But I think the market is the great protector there, actually. So the expected cost of a dose of psilocybin, what will it be? You know, $400, $600 a dose, or free. I mean, we're talking about it being restricted and being pharmaceutically controlled for therapeutic treatment. But I think there's no possible way that they can restrict access to that in other settings. And in fact, the biggest advantage that has is that they are freely available. They are, you know, people can go and pick them in their backyard in some cases. So I think there is a significant protection in that fact. But clinical therapeutic access is going to be a problem. So current expectations of cost of treatment in Australia is somewhere, I think, around $20,000 for a treatment, which is significant. It's not as costly as longitudinal pharmaceutical and psychotherapeutic treatment. MAPS did a great deal of research and on this, and they thought their rough estimate was that they were saving about $100,000 per patient. And so, these economic factors, I think, actually may in fact be protective. But the real issue that I am concerned about is access. Who has access to it at a therapeutic level, particularly considering that these substances are not going to be covered by Medicare, these treatments are not going to be Medicare subsidised, at least initially. So they're only going to be available to those people who have enough money to access them. I think there will be funding bodies that will jump on board to broaden access. People like DVA, I think, will probably provide access because it's cost effective for treatment. I mean, just to put that in perspective, $20,000 sounds like a lot, but I've been involved in the treatment of soldiers that's cost $500,000, $600,000. So there is a lot of efficacy financially, but yeah, we've got to be very careful.
Yeah, look, I think I'm largely in agreement on that. I think but what I would say is that because of the cost, and because the cost, if you're doing the pharmaceutical, therapeutic, you have a psychiatrist in the loop, and etc. Because we know this is going to cost a lot, and it's likely to be that way for the foreseeable future, or at least for the initially. This plus hype equals a lot of unmet demand, and that's going to go somewhere. And where that's going to be is going to be underground settings, which is why the work that people have to do in engaging with the underground practices. I want to say the mainstream of psychedelics isn't in friggin' psychiatry practices. It's in completely different settings. So it's, I hesitate to call, what's going to happen come June the mainstream of psychedelics, because it's not. But yeah, it's being able to kind of still engage with and do the harm reduction work and the engagement with these non-clinical settings is going to be more important than it ever has been before, because as this process has gone, and I've watched this for a long time, the interest in this is just phenomenal, and it's from, and it's what's difficult is that there are a lot of people interested in psychedelics who don't have a diagnosed mental illness, but there are a lot of people who are, and some of those people who really ought to be seen under the kind of conditions that Charles talking about. That's not going to happen for them. They're going to end up in other settings, and there's just a lot of work to be done in keeping people safe.
And I think, Sam, that's one of the risks, isn't it, is that you have people who really should be cared for very, very carefully, sometimes, out of desperation, throwing themselves into contexts where they may, in fact, undergo harm. And, so there's a lot of work for us to do this in a meaningful way.
Thank you. And one question from the virtual audience.
Just before we move on to that question, I just want to acknowledge the concerns of patenting, but the reality that there is unbroken medicine lineages around the world, that pass on from generation to generation, particularly Wachuma, San Pedro, and ayahuasca. Those traditions cannot be patented; they will not be replicated in the labs, and there will always be a place for them. And I think, as you're pointing to, the market will take care of itself, but also the community will take care of itself. There's a certain amount of the population that will never want to go to the clinical trials. They won't belong there, and they will find their way to these lineage holders. So I think, as clinicians, we need to hold all of those worlds in mind. And this leads into the next question. Is it unethical to recommend self-medication or self-dosing of psychedelics if someone, is suffering, has mental health issues, but doesn't fit that tight criteria that the TGA has outlined? As a clinician, Trail.
Sam?
As
the ethicist.
Yeah.
The ethicist. My friends who are legitimate ethicists who actually have PhDs that concentrated on ethics are going to give me a fair bit of crap about this later, I suspect. I'm an ethicist. Look, it is hard. That's a really difficult question because it's a lot of things to weigh up. And there is no easy answer where you're sort of weighing up the risks of harm, the risks of not making a recommendation. what weight do you put on the fact that something is illegal in isolation from your other kind of moral and ethical things that you're considering? I don't think there is an easy answer to that. But which is a very long way of saying, it could go either way. There will be some cases where, based on the individual circumstances, where it would be unethical to make that recommendation. And it's also who's making the recommendation and under what circumstances. Like if I'm not a psychologist or a therapist, but imagine I were, and I say, oh, look, we can't do this, you don't fit this criteria, but you can go and do this. Well, am I abdicating my... I'm making this recommendation to them. The level of risk to me as a professional, it's a different kind of risk that I'm placing this person in by making this recommendation. So it's a lot of different things to consider.
Yeah, I think just to jump on that, I think for a clinician to make that recommendation would be very problematic. To recommend someone go away, in particular by themselves, and do that, I think is. Yeah, I would say that constitutes unethical practice from a clinical standpoint.
Thank you. So another question from the audience. This hand up the front, could you run all the way around? Is that all right?
Have we got 2 microphones? We could do one and then move to the next one.
Yeah.
This whole notion of like enlightenment that you hear about from the Eastern traditions, which seems to be very common now in other traditions, this kind of thing about waking up in life, and there are various kind of practices or self-inquiry that sort of leads to what seems to be a very common experience of no self and the recognition of how kind of distorted thoughts are, and a bit about what you were talking about reality just being a false projection, and that there's a knowledge, a knowing that's outside the mind and outside normal thinking. So it seems to be like a universal experience to sort of great sages and people like that have woken up. How does that relate to the psychedelic experience, and can psychedelics sort of fast track to something like that, is my question.
Good question.
I mean, so one of the things I find most relevant here is how many of today's senior Western teachers of Buddhist meditation, but also various forms of Hindu meditation, got their start with psychedelics. So a lot of people have gone public. I mean, the famous case is Ram Dass, formerly Richard Alpert, who was engaged in psychedelic research with Timothy Leary at Harvard, but there are various other people, Lama Surya Das, I think Jack Cornfield, Tara Brach, lots of very senior, esteemed, well-respected Western teachers of meditation have said, look, I experienced psychedelics back in the 60s. They showed me what my mind was capable of. They showed me that there is this other way of experiencing the world and relating to it that is immensely worthy of pursuit, and I then turn to these disciplines as a way of attempting to actually realise that as a kind of default way of experiencing the world. In terms of the fast track question, I think that's very interesting, and all I will say is that it needs to be acknowledged that it's an empirical question, you know. In Buddhism you have what's called the fifth precept, which is the injunction not to use intoxicants that cause heedlessness, is how the original Pali is most commonly translated, so there's a bit of room for debate there. A lot of Buddhists just take that as no intoxicants whatsoever, but there are, as the study I described with the Zen Roshi shows, there are Buddhists, you know, there are authentic, recognised Buddhist meditation teachers who are willing to be creative in their interpretation of these traditions, and so I would love to see more empirical research. It poses formidable challenges because how do you operationalise, you know, whether someone is getting closer to awakening? But maybe that question can be answered. I mean, there's a lot of really exciting work going on in neuroscience of getting advanced meditators who purport to be able to have these pure consciousness experiences and looking at what goes on in their brain in the neuroimaging scanner. So I can see the potential for a lot of super interesting research in which, you know, practitioners at various stages in these traditions are given psychedelic experiences and then a study to see to what extent their capacity to enter various meditative states, insofar as we can evaluate that, actually is enhanced.
Psychedelics may be a gateway drug to enlightenment.
I guess the only thing that I would add to this is maybe enlightenment, like that's a word that carries kind of a bit of baggage, right? And I think it's like, even if it is a fast track to enlightenment, construed a certain way, I'd really caution people about equating that with a fast track to wisdom, if there is such a thing, because I don't think that would be the case.
And if it's all right, I'll throw in a caveat as well, because a lot of my own research focuses around neural correlates for awakening. And I tend to have a pretty critical lens on the idea that there is a sort of singular set of correlates that we could identify for awakening experiences, given the diversity of experiences reported across traditions. And so in relation to that, I put a word of caution in around sort of some of the assumptions in there, but also wanted to add that within Buddhist traditions, particularly Vajrayana, Tibetan lineages, there is a historic usage of psychedelic medicines.
Is that really well established?
It's an open question, but Amritsar, yeah, do you want to speak to that, Cheryl?
Well, it's interesting. I was talking to Michael Winkelman a while ago, and he was saying that they were looking at some of this in some of the Hindu temples as well, and there's statues of mushrooms at the gateways of the temples and things like that. So I think there's significant reason to think that may be the case, but and it's how evidential that is, I'm not 100% sure.
It's just an interesting subject too of whether whether we're looking forward for an empirical basis for the integration of psychedelics and contemplative practices, or whether we might look back at the historic integration and suggest that might in itself speak to some of these questions. Sorry. Yeah. So is there any other questions? So this gentleman at the back with the... Oh, sorry. Yeah. Great, go for it.
Yeah. Thanks for taking my question. So we've talked a bit about transpersonalism, and so that's the gateway to my question. So what's the place of psychedelics during this time of massive human destruction? And so what does the love of wisdom have to teach us about this state and what we can do about it?
I co-authored a paper recently arguing something that is very controversial, and that you're supposed to be a bit sort of simple-minded and naive if you argue, which is that psychedelics might actually be able to help a bit with the ecological crisis. This is something that people have thought since the 60s, and definitely there are very naive versions of this idea, but I mean there's a lot of evidence now, or a decent amount of evidence, a growing body of evidence, that psychedelic experiences, especially when they're had in natural settings, but even when they're not, even when they're had in the bowels of a hospital, can increase people's feelings of connectedness to nature for, up to a year after the experience. And this, in some cases, has been shown to have behavioural outcomes, to actually increase people's participation in pro-environmental behaviours and so on. And so, yeah, I think it's very interesting from a theoretical perspective to try and understand why that happens, right? What is it about these drugs and what they do to the mind and brain that means that even when you're in the bowels of a hospital, the mind still tends to go to this connection to plants and trees and animals and the natural world. But I think there's at least something worth looking at there. There's certainly no suggestion of any kind of panacea or whatever, but what my colleague Nin Kirkham and I argued is that, but drawing on her prior work, she has this, works in the tradition of environmental virtue ethics, which is the idea that the right way to think about our moral relationship to the natural environment is in terms of virtues, these complex character traits, ways of seeing and acting and emoting and so on, that dispose us to relate properly to the natural environment. And our thesis was that the evidence so far suggests that psychedelic experiences, carefully conducted, could help to catalyse the development of these environmental virtues. And so that's something that I think should be investigated more fully, because if there's anything there, that seems worth knowing about.
Yeah, if I can just jump in on that, Chris, that's really interesting, because I think about this in neo-Piagetian kind of developmental psychology. Less than 3% of the population is thought to develop post-formally, which the first step in post-formal development in those neo-Piagetian models is systemic and intersystemic awareness. And so it seems to be that that would be a real catalyst in terms of what you're talking about. There's a capacity to develop the ability to see and experience the world in that way. And certainly in those neo-Piagetian kind of models, a lot of the problems with the world are developmental problems for us as a species. So very interesting.
So we've got online question I'll give a go at and we can pass it on. So what do the panellists think of the idea of proliferating 5-MeO-DMT as a treatment for depression, which is currently happening and it's emerging? Might it be like shooting a bazooka at a mosquito? So can I give this a crack? Yeah.
Yes, it might. I'm a
Good
bit
analogy.
worried, to be honest.
Yeah.
I think it seems, it might be a bit more than is strictly necessary, and a bit more risky than is strictly necessary. A lot of people seem to go fine with it under controlled conditions, but I wouldn't be surprised if there's a higher rate of adverse events than other psychedelics, even when lots of care is taken. So you have to ask, is it necessary? Is it going to give us something that psilocybin can't, for instance?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, the truth is that 5-MeO, it is a riskier medicine. There is no way around that. You have to be so much more careful with that than you do with a lot of other psychedelics. So it's it carries more risk, but it is that's that is an experience that's going to be. It is a bazooka, and so I think it's like, well, is it necessary? But if it were, what do we do if it works on the people that psilocybin doesn't work on? And which is, I'm even saying that, I'm thinking about it completely the wrong way, but you know what I mean.
I guess I'll just add from what I've observed from my experience and from clinical experience, is one of the medicines that I feel really abruptly breaks down predictive processing and models of reality very quickly and can rip people's trauma up without any permission or consent, and then abruptly thrown into no models of reality with their trauma, and it can be really fragmenting for people. And if there's any schizotypal personality processes, psychosis, minimal reflective functioning, as I mentioned with metacognition, I've found that people can be really fragmented and take a really long time to integrate. And then if you add a dodgy guide, any sexual encounters during that medicine, so it's one that I have huge caution with. But in saying that, I know many people that have used it appropriately and has been incredible, particularly the lower doses. People forget that there's options. You don't have to go for the bazooka. There can be, smaller entry points into that medicine and, get the support in the container to really hold it.
Yeah, there's a book I haven't gotten around to reading yet, but it's by a guy, Robert Augustus Masters, I think is his name, Darkness Shining Wild, and he was a fairly seasoned sort of spiritual practitioner and then had a dose of 5-MeO, which gave him what he considered a psychotic break, and he took about a year or so to sort of piece himself back together. He's the guy actually who came up with the concept of spiritual bypassing, I think. So...
We might have final question and then I'll wrap it up, or... This person looks keen over here.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Is this on? Yeah, cool. So I suppose we've got at one end of the spectrum recreational experiences, very much like, separated from the medical institutions, from all this, and then the trials at the other end, and then somewhere in the middle is the murky middle that is emerging, and. I think, Trail, you said recently to me something about, that when people have psychedelic experiences, it can generate metacognition, or it creates a metacognitive view, but they'll generally collapse back into the view that they held prior if it's not sufficiently stabilised. So I guess you can see from that view why a lot of people who have recreational experiences may become unsatisfied over time and head more towards this direction over here. At the same time, obviously what happens and this is in a way that recreational use is now becoming somewhat informed by research and, integration as it's being created through the trials and so on. At the same time, obviously the trials are influenced by this history of recreational use or underground psychedelic psychotherapy and all these things. So in this middle, and actually just one thing to throw in that I'm not sure is really on people's radar, but cannabis-assisted psychotherapy may be one of the most immediately accessible psychotherapies in Australia, or here in Victoria particularly, because the legalised cannabis party won enough seats that they essentially hold the balance of power here in Victoria. If they're going to have any demand, of course, it's going to be to legalise cannabis, and that creates an opportunity for a form of therapy that could reach the masses very quickly. It wouldn't necessarily have to go through the TGA approval process. So I guess what I'm saying, why I'm bringing that up, is just that this is getting increasingly murky and complex, and it seems like there needs to be, outside of the clinical sphere, more and more spaces for integration, for support, for development of metacognition. And we've touched on those a little bit tonight, but I wondered if any of you wanted to say more about what you see emerging and what you would hope to emerge to support responsible, growth-orientated psychedelic use.
Do you mind if I speak to the cannabis? Is that okay? So I'm training under Saj Ravi, the psychedelic somatic psychotherapy, and I began that out of my frustration with the wait for the TGA decision, but also the inaccessibility and the cost. So there are psychedelic therapists in Australia that are legally able to work with people with cannabis, and what we're seeing is that it's a huge potential for PTSD in a way that might be a little bit unique, and Trail can support this as well, but really from a relational perspective, from a bottom-up processing, so somatic experiences, and it's affordable and it's quite accessible now. It's prescribable for autism, ADHD, from chronic pain, cancer, epilepsy, depression, anxiety. It's quite accessible, and there are therapists working in this space. I just wanted to highlight that.
Yeah, I agree, Lani. I will say this publicly. I haven't said it publicly before, but I actually think that the cannabis-assisted psychotherapy might prove in the long run to be more beneficial for PTSD treatment than MDMA. That's certainly my suggestion. We've been conducting, some exploratory work around it and doing some sessional work with it, and it's incredibly. It's one of those ones that just seems to fly under the radar. People aren't really paying enough attention to it. There's a number of different approaches to it. There's not a clear clinical model for it yet, I don't think. There's a number of different views. There's the view that Sarge puts forward, which is has a really strong bottom-up kind of processing model. But there are other models which are, I guess a little bit more almost spiritualist in their kind of views. So it's still early days, but I'm very interested to see where that space goes clinically. I think there's a lot of legs in that work.
I think we have to wrap it up. I know people probably have a lot of questions, but feel free to contact us, individually. I'm sure, everyone's happy to answer any burning questions, and we'll send out some resources in the next week. And just want to, thank you all for your wisdom and the dedication in life that it takes to get to this level of insight and knowledge. It comes with a lot of personal reflection, often a lot of initial student poverty, and then the hard work.
Just initial.
And how excited I am to share this this recording with my students and to embed this. Even though I actually identify deeply with the spiritual world and plant phenomenology, and the opposite to you, Chris, I'm so excited to weave this into my work so that I stay grounded, so that I can support people to find their perspective and be really cautious of what I bring to the psychedelic container. Because when we talk about what could go wrong in this psychedelic space, it's the humans, and if we don't have that reflective capacity to see what's ours and support clients to find, what's theirs, I think, really important.
Just thank the panel one final time.
Yay!
And thank you to Lani and Signs of Life.
And shameless plug, on the 8th of June, we've got a webinar focusing on psychedelic cults and narcissistic leadership and the whistleblower phenomena. All very real in Australia and overseas, and I invite you to attend that as a group of us have developed some pretty sophisticated harm reduction resources for professionals and clients entering this space so that they can self-assess who is safe and where to work and how to look after themselves. So, thank you.